Imagine, if you will, a house that you purchased sometime in the last decade. A house that represented at the moment of acquisition the culmination of a long and often arduous search through open houses and online listings, and the peculiar emotional labor of picturing your life unfolding within the walls of a stranger's former home. You stood in the backyard and imagined summer evenings. You stood in the kitchen and imagined holiday gatherings. And you stood in the primary bedroom and imagined the quiet, ordinary intimacy of a life shared with the people you love. And all of those imaginings were real and valid, and they formed the emotional foundation upon which you signed a stack of documents thicker than any book you have ever read, committing yourself to a monthly payment that would persist for 3 decades and a relationship with a financial institution that would outlast most friendships and many marriages. But now, several years into that arrangement, something has shifted in the calculus of your contentment. And the shift is not dramatic or cinematic, but rather a slow, cumulative accumulation of small frictions and quiet disappointments that have transformed the house from a sanctuary into something more closely resembling a cage whose door you have somehow forgotten is not actually locked. The commute that seemed reasonable on a map has become, in the lived reality of rush hour traffic and construction delays, a daily drain on your finite reserves of patience and energy. The school district that was adequate for a childless couple has revealed its inadequacies now that you have a 7-year-old whose curiosity and potential deserve better nurturing. The roof that passed inspection with flying colors has begun to leak during heavy rains, and the water heater that was described as recently updated has failed twice in the past 18 months, and the foundation has developed a crack that runs from the corner of the garage to the base of the chimney, in a way that your neighbor, who claims to know about these things, describes with a wince and a shake of the head. And yet, despite the accumulating evidence that this house is no longer serving you and may in fact be actively harming your financial and emotional well-being, you remain. You stay put, you patch the roof, you replace the water heater, you ignore the crack in the foundation, and you try, with varying degrees of success, to ignore the quiet voice that whispers in the early morning hours that you have made a terrible mistake, and that the only thing worse than making the mistake would be admitting that you made it. This is the behavioral cartoon of the sunk cost fallacy, playing out in a laboratory experiment with abstract tokens and hypothetical scenarios, but in the largest and most consequential financial decision that most households will ever make. And the cost of staying in the cartoon is far higher than most people are willing to calculate. The sunk cost fallacy is one of the most robust and well-documented phenomena in the entire field of behavioral economics, and its basic mechanics are simple enough to be described in a single sentence. Yet its power over human decision-making is so profound and so pervasive that knowing about it is almost entirely ineffective as a defense against it. The fallacy consists of the human tendency to continue investing resources, time, money, effort, emotional energy into a failing course of action simply because one has already invested resources into it, even when the rational calculation of future costs and future benefits clearly indicates that abandoning the course of action and redirecting one's resources elsewhere would produce a superior outcome. The resources that have already been invested are sunk, meaning they cannot be recovered regardless of what decision is made going forward, and in a perfectly rational world, inhabited by perfectly rational actors, sunk costs would have exactly zero influence on decisions about the future. The rational actor would look at the current situation, assess the expected future costs and future benefits of all available options, and choose the option that maximizes future well-being, with no regard whatsoever for what was spent to arrive at the current situation. But human beings are not perfectly rational actors, and the human brain did not evolve to solve abstract optimization problems in a world of mortgage amortization schedules and property tax assessments. The human brain evolved to solve problems of survival and social standing in small, tight-knit groups where the efficient allocation of scarce resources was important, but where the appearance of consistency, commitment, and competence was often even more important. Admitting that a previous decision was mistaken carries a heavy social and psychological cost, a cost that the brain, in its ancient wisdom, is often willing to pay for by doubling down on the mistaken decision and hoping, against all evidence, that the situation will somehow improve and that the mistake will never have to be publicly or privately acknowledged. When we apply this understanding of the sunk cost fallacy specifically to the domain of residential real estate and mortgage debt, we encounter a perfect storm of psychological vulnerabilities that makes the fallacy particularly potent and particularly difficult to escape. A mortgage is not merely a financial instrument. It is a financial instrument that is inextricably bound up with the most emotionally charged and identity-defining domain of modern life, which is the home. The home is where you sleep, where you raise your children, where you retreat from the demands of the world, and where you construct and maintain the private self that exists behind the public persona you present to colleagues and acquaintances. To admit that you made a mistake in the purchase of a home is to admit that the private sanctuary you have built is flawed, that the judgment you exercised in selecting it was faulty, and that the narrative you have been telling yourself and others about your life and your progress is, at least in part, a fiction. This is an admission that most people will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid making, and the mortgage itself, with its 30-year term and its immovable monthly payment and its intricate web of associated costs and obligations, provides the perfect cognitive architecture for the sunk cost fallacy to take root and flourish. Every monthly payment that you make is another deposit into the psychological account labeled, "I have invested too much in this house to walk away now." And the longer you stay, the larger that account grows, and the more unthinkable it becomes to even entertain the possibility of leaving. The mortgage payment becomes a kind of loyalty oath, a recurring affirmation of the wisdom of the original decision, and to stop making that payment, to sell the house at a loss, or to walk away from it entirely would be to admit that all of those previous payments were made in service of a mistake, and that admission feels, to the human nervous system, like a form of death. The mathematical breakdown of what the sunk cost fallacy is actually costing a household that remains in a bad mortgage situation is both sobering and, for those who are willing to look at the numbers clearly, potentially liberating. Let us construct a representative scenario that captures the essential features of this trap without exaggerating the numbers or resorting to extreme cases. Imagine a household that purchased a home for $400,000 with a 10% down payment, resulting in a mortgage balance of $360,000 at an interest rate of 4.5%. The household has lived in the home for 7 years and has made 84 monthly payments of approximately $2,400, which includes principal, interest, property taxes, and insurance. Over those 7 years, the household has paid roughly $140,000 in interest to the lender, plus another $30,000 in property taxes and insurance premiums, and has accumulated approximately $40,000 in home equity through the slow, front-loaded amortization of the mortgage. The home has not appreciated significantly due to a combination of local market conditions and the deferred maintenance issues that have been accumulating in the background, and a realistic assessment of its current market value places it at around $380,000. Which is $20,000 less than the original purchase price. If the household were to sell the home today, after accounting for real estate commissions and closing costs, They would walk away from the closing table with essentially zero equity and would have to write a small check to cover the shortfall between the sale proceeds and the remaining mortgage balance. The psychological weight of this outcome is crushing. 7 years of payments, $170,000 of out-of-pocket housing costs, and at the end of it all, nothing to show for it except the privilege of having had a place to live during those 7 years and the opportunity to start over from zero. But the mathematical analysis cannot stop at the calculation of what has already been lost, because what has already been lost is sunk and cannot be recovered regardless of whether the household stays or goes. The relevant question for the household facing this situation is not, "How much have I already spent on this house?" but rather, "What are the expected future costs and benefits of staying in this house for the next 5 or 10 or 20 years, compared to the expected future costs and benefits of selling now and moving to a different housing situation?" And when this forward-looking analysis is performed with clear eyes and honest numbers, the conclusion is often starkly different from the conclusion that the sunk cost fallacy would have the household believe. If the household remains in the current home, they will continue to incur the costs of the commute that is draining their time and energy, the costs of the inadequate school district that may require private school tuition or simply a diminished educational experience for their child, and the costs of the deferred maintenance items that are not going to repair themselves and will only become more expensive as they are allowed to deteriorate further. They will also continue to make mortgage payments on a loan whose interest rate, while reasonable by historical standards, is not generating any meaningful equity accumulation because the underlying asset is not appreciating. If instead, the household sells the home, absorbs the small loss at closing, and moves to a rental property or a different home in a better location with better schools and a more manageable commute, they will exchange the known costs of staying for a new set of costs that may, upon careful examination, be substantially lower in both financial and emotional terms, even after accounting for the one-time transaction costs of the move. The sunk cost fallacy keeps the household trapped in the current situation by fixating their attention on the unrecoverable past while blinding them to the recoverable future. And the mathematical tragedy of this blindness is that it often causes people to remain in situations that are not merely suboptimal but actively destructive, hemorrhaging money and well-being month after month because they cannot bear to acknowledge that the first 7 years of bleeding were a mistake. When we zoom out from the individual household's mortgage statement and apply a systemic lens to the sunk cost phenomenon in residential real estate, we encounter a larger and more troubling picture of how the entire housing finance system is structured to exploit and amplify this particular cognitive vulnerability. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, which is the cornerstone of American housing policy and the primary vehicle through which the middle class has accumulated wealth over the past several generations, is an instrument that is exquisitely designed to maximize the psychological weight of sunk costs. The long amortization period means that the early years of the loan are overwhelmingly devoted to paying interest rather than principal, which means that the household accumulates equity very slowly in the first decade of ownership and is therefore particularly vulnerable to the sunk cost fallacy during the period when they are most likely to discover that the home they purchased is not the right fit for their evolving lives. The transaction costs associated with buying and selling real estate, which typically amount to 6 to 8% of the property's value when all commissions, fees, and closing costs are aggregated, create a substantial financial barrier to exit that reinforces the psychological barrier erected by the sunk cost fallacy. The tax code, with its deduction for mortgage interest and its exclusion of capital gains on the sale of a primary residence, provides additional incentives to remain in a home and to view the mortgage as a kind of financial talisman, rather than simply a debt instrument that should be evaluated on its forward-looking economic merits. And the broader culture of homeownership, with its deeply embedded narrative that renting is throwing money away, and that buying a home is the essential rite of passage into responsible adulthood, provides a constant stream of social reinforcement for the decision to stay put, even when staying put is mathematically and emotionally irrational. The system, in other words, is not neutral with respect to the sunk cost fallacy. It is tilted at every level toward keeping people in homes that may no longer be serving them, because a stable, immobile population of mortgage-paying homeowners is, from the perspective of the financial and governmental institutions that benefit from that stability, a highly desirable outcome. The identity shift required to break free from the sunk cost of a bad mortgage is one of the more difficult psychological maneuvers that a person can attempt, because it requires not merely a change in financial strategy, but a fundamental reorientation of how one relates to the past and how one defines the meaning of a mistake. The shift begins with the recognition that the money you have already spent on the mortgage, the interest you have already paid to the lender, the repairs you have already made to the roof and the water heater, and the emotional energy you have already invested in trying to make the house feel like a home are all gone, irretrievably and permanently, and that no decision you make from this moment forward can bring any of it back. This recognition, which sounds simple when stated in words, is in practice one of the most difficult acts of cognitive and emotional discipline that a human being can perform, because it requires the deliberate override of a neural circuit that has been reinforced by millions of years of evolution and by a lifetime of cultural conditioning. The circuit screams that walking away is a waste, that selling at a loss is a failure, that admitting the mistake is a humiliation, and the circuit is so loud and so insistent that it drowns out the quieter, more rational voice that is trying to explain that staying is the actual waste, that remaining in the mistake is the actual failure, and that the only true humiliation is allowing pride and fear to trap you in a situation that is slowly and quietly draining the finite resources of your one and only life. The identity shift involves relocating your sense of self from the house to something more durable and more portable. Your relationships, your skills, your values, your capacity to adapt and to make sound decisions in the face of uncertainty. You are not the house, and you are not the mortgage, and you are not the mistake you made when you signed the papers 7 years ago. You are the person who made that decision with the best information and the best intentions you had at the time. And you are now the person who has acquired new information and who has the opportunity to make a new decision that better aligns with the reality of your current circumstances and the trajectory of your future aspirations. This is not failure. This is learning, and learning is the only reliable path through the fog of an uncertain world. The calm closing of this inquiry is not a call to abandon home ownership or to treat mortgage debt as inherently toxic, or to view the 30-year fixed-rate loan as a trap that should be avoided at all costs. Home ownership, for many households and in many circumstances, remains a sensible and wealth-building component of a diversified financial life. And the stability and predictability of a fixed-rate mortgage can provide genuine psychological and economic benefits that are not easily replicated in other housing arrangements. The calm closing is, instead, an invitation to hold your mortgage and your home with a lighter grip, to view them as instruments that serve your life rather than as identities that define it, and to remain open to the possibility that the best decision you can make today about your housing situation may be different from the best decision you could have made 7 years ago. Because you are different, and the world is different, and the house is different, the sunk cost fallacy will always be present, whispering its ancient warnings about the shame of abandoning a previous commitment. But you do not have to obey the whisper. You can acknowledge it, thank it for its concern, and then turn your attention to the only question that actually matters. Given where you are now and what you know now, what is the path forward that maximizes the well-being of the people who live within the walls of whatever home you choose to inhabit? The mortgage payment you made last month is gone, and the mortgage payment you will make next month is a new decision, and the door to the cage has never actually been locked. You can stay if staying is truly the right choice for the life you want to live, but you should stay because you have chosen to stay, not because you have forgotten that leaving is an option.